The Man from Taured. Chapter 1, The Arrival. The humid air of Tokyo's Haneda Airport clung to everyone who walked through its gates that sweltering July day in 1954. It was business as usual for the customs officers, each handling a steady stream of travelers from all corners of the globe. A man in a dark suit stepped up to the counter, setting down his briefcase with practiced ease. His appearance was unremarkable, save for his air of confidence and piercing dark eyes. His hair was slicked back, and he looked well-groomed, as if every detail of his appearance had been carefully considered. The customs officer barely glanced at him as he reached for the passport, expecting yet another French or British traveler. The officer's face tightened as he stared at the passport's cover. It was reddish-brown, embossed with symbols and a script he didn't recognize. When he flipped it open, he noticed a peculiar name for the country: Taured. "Taured?" the officer muttered, his brow furrowing. "Yes, Taured." The man answered with mild impatience, as though he had given this answer many times before. "My homeland, of course," he added, catching the officer's perplexed expression. The officer blinked, his confusion mounting. "Where did you say Taured was again?" The man let out a small sigh, as if the answer should be obvious. "Between France and Spain, of course," he replied in an accent that hinted at European origins, but wasn't quite identifiable. The customs officer had never heard of such a country, and a creeping unease settled over him. "One moment," he muttered, summoning a nearby supervisor. "Sir, are you certain about this?" the supervisor asked after glancing at the passport. "Yes, I'm certain," the traveler replied, his voice growing sharper. "I have been through Tokyo multiple times. Just this past April, in fact. I've been traveling for my company for years. Is this some kind of joke?" They led him to a small room nearby, his protests growing louder as he was asked to sit down. The officers photocopied his passport, examined his other documents, and flipped through his travel records. His driver's license, bank cards, and company ID all looked authentic, but referenced names and places that didn't appear in any of their records. "I work for a firm based here in Tokyo," the man insisted, his irritation shifting to concern. He named the district where he said his office was located. When they called the company, they discovered no such office existed there, or anywhere else in Tokyo. As the hours passed, the traveler's frustration turned to fear. "This is impossible," he whispered, his hands beginning to tremble. "I was just in Taured yesterday. I flew from my home airport as always. What are you saying?" The officers exchanged wary looks, and one tried to reassure him. "We'll keep checking, sir. Perhaps this is a misunderstanding." The man only shook his head, his face drawn. "I know my own country," he murmured as though trying to convince himself. "It has to exist." Chapter 2. The Interrogation. Two officers took the traveler deeper into questioning, doing their best to keep their tone gentle. The traveler grew more frantic with each question, giving answers that only seemed to deepen the mystery. When asked about Taured's location, he launched into a detailed description. He named cities, landmarks, and rivers that supposedly bordered France and Spain. But to the officer's ears, it sounded like he was describing a version of Europe that existed in some parallel world. One officer pushed a world map toward him, his finger tapping insistently on the empty space between Andorra and France. "Sir, look for yourself. There's no country called Taured here." The traveler leaned forward, his dark eyes widening as he took in the unfamiliar sight. "This map is outdated," he insisted. "My home is right here." His finger pointed to the blank stretch of mountains. He looked up, his expression a mixture of frustration and dread. "How can this be?" "Tell us more about Taured," the other officer urged, trying to stay calm. "Anything at all. Language, government, traditions?" The man blinked, seemingly dazed by the request, but he answered dutifully. Taured, he explained, was a constitutional monarchy, independent for nearly 1,000 years. They spoke a unique language, a blend of French and Spanish, with regional dialects. The officers listened, exchanging worried glances. They had spent their entire careers learning about the world, yet everything he said felt like the fabric of a dream. And what's more, it was clear he believed every word. It was as if he had stepped out of another version of reality. "I need to speak to my company," the man pleaded, clutching his briefcase. "I have an appointment here in Tokyo. You're wasting time." Of course, one of the officers nodded, though they both knew that call would go nowhere. Still, they gave him a room at a nearby hotel, guarded by two officers for the night. "We'll keep working on this in the morning," one officer said, trying to be reassuring. The man's face softened, but he murmured something as they left. What happens if it's gone? Chapter 3. Vanishing Point. The hotel room was small, with a single bed and a chair by the window, which overlooked the sprawling lights of Tokyo. The traveler sat there, staring out into the vast city that now felt foreign. He clenched his passport in his hand, feeling its familiar weight. But even that felt strange now. A fear crept into his thoughts. What if he really couldn't go back? Hours dragged on, the ticking of the clock on the wall growing louder with each passing minute. His eyelids grew heavy, and he drifted into an uneasy sleep, his dreams filled with images of his home vanishing into darkness, like a city swallowed by shadows. Morning came, but when the guards outside his door knocked to take him back for questioning, there was no answer. They entered the room, finding it empty. The traveler, his suitcase, his passport, everything was gone. The officers scoured the room, even pulling up the carpet and checking every inch for clues, but found nothing to suggest where he might have gone. The windows were locked from the inside, and there was no sign of forced entry. It was as if the man from Taured had simply vanished. An investigation was launched, but it led to dead ends. The photocopies of his documents had disappeared from their files, leaving only faint impressions in the memory of the airport staff. The officers who had spoken to him struggled to understand, left with a haunting sense of having encountered something outside their reality. Chapter 4. A Return, years later. Nearly 20 years passed, and the story of the man from Taured became a strange tale told by airport staff, whispered about in the corners of the customs office. It was a mystery they all knew but never dared try to solve. Then on a rainy November evening in 1973, a man appeared at Paris's Charles de Gaulle airport. The officer who first met him barely registered his presence until he saw the name on the passport. Taured. The officer's pulse quickened, memories of an impossible story resurfacing. He glanced up, finding himself face to face with the man from the story. Now older, his once dark hair dusted with gray. The traveler handed over his passport, his eyes expressionless but weary. "Taured," the officer said, forcing himself to stay calm. "Sir, may I ask, have you been to Tokyo?" The traveler's face flickered with something like recognition, but it faded almost immediately. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about." But his tone was off, and for just a moment, a trace of sadness crossed his face. As the officer tried to collect his thoughts, the man leaned in slightly, his voice low. "Sometimes, we're not meant to go back to where we started." And with that, he took his passport, gave a courteous nod, and disappeared into the bustling airport crowd. The officer watched him until he was out of sight, feeling as if he had brushed against something incomprehensible. Epilogue. To this day, the man from Taured remains an enigma, a tale that drifts between fact and fiction. Those who claim to have met him swear that he existed, even as their memories of him feel like fleeting dreams. Some say he was a lost traveler from a parallel world, forever seeking his way back to a place that no longer exists. Others believe he was a living ghost, a relic of a reality that slipped away, leaving him stranded in ours. And perhaps somewhere out there, he is still searching for his way back home, carrying with him the memory of a country no one else can remember.